Hello, this is Dr. Kate Antonova, Professor of History at the City University of New York, and this is History in Practice. Today, I want to tell you about how historians, academic historians, and if you're not sure what the distinction is, I already made a video, go check it out. What do academic historians actually do? You don't see us very often in movies, probably because there is very little of visual interest in what we do, and it certainly doesn't look very active. Do we stand in front of a chalkboard? That's part of what we do. Do we sit in a coffee shop and think? Yes, that's part of what we do. Do we type rapidly while staring thoughtfully at a glowing screen? Yes, we do. Those are all parts of it, obviously. That's probably what you've seen in movies if you've seen anything at all. But none of it really gets at what we actually do. So the most visible thing we do is teach. Your typical, and again, what does typical even mean? I'll have another video on the different kinds of academic historians and the various ranks and status and all that nonsense about it. But what most academic historians do is both teach and research. So teaching is the most visible part that people have seen. Teaching is the part where, if not done well, it can really give the whole discipline and all of us in it a bad reputation, unfortunately. So please, if you've had a bad history professor in your past at some point, please don't hold this against all of us or the discipline itself. It can be better, and it's getting better. Teaching is standing in front of a whiteboard or chalkboard, or increasingly these days, more likely a PowerPoint or something fancier, right? But we're teaching. Teaching largely, traditionally, what were called lecture classes, where you're kind of lecturing through what happened. And that's the kind of cliche like Dr. Binns and Harry Potter, right? Professor Binns and Harry Potter. I don't know if he was a doctor or not. Going through names and dates. It can look like that even now, although when done well, it's not actually. If you're hearing names and dates, you may be missing the forest for the trees. What it really is a narrative argument, which is not simply a narrative or story of what happened, names and dates. A narrative argument is using a narrative to make an argument about cause and effect over time in the past. What caused particular events? What were the effects of particular events? What causes change over time? Where are the continuities as opposed to changes over time? Those are the things historians study. Those are the things we talk about in lectures. When we're lecturing and it seems like you're hearing a lot of names and dates, what you're actually doing is hearing a construction, a very thoughtful, selective construction of names and dates that highlight moments, points of change, cause, and effect over time that we're really looking for, and that describe all the factors that go into each change over time, right? That's ideally how it's done. Also, of course, ideally, a lecture should not be a sage on the stage droning from the front. It should be a conversation. Not everybody's teaching is the same, but and there's a place for lecture. In some cases, that's kind of the only way to explain long things, which is really honestly what I'm doing in these videos, right? Though you have the opportunity to comment, so does anyone attending a lecture. But in some cases, things are just best explained in person. These are a lot of the things I'm going to talk about in this channel, that I have talked about in this channel, are things that I've written about. I have a book called The Essential Guide to Writing History, where all of this is already written down. I've written it in many other venues, but YouTube is one of the ways to reach people. And so that's what I'm trying here. And one of the ways that people can digest information actually relatively easily is having it explained to them by a human. It doesn't have to be dry, right? So anyways, part of what we do is give lectures. A lot of our courses, there are also seminars or colloquia or whatever. There's various old-fashioned words for them, but it's where basically the professor and the students have all done a reading together before class. We come in and discuss the readings together, and those readings may be primary sources where we discuss that's evidence from the past, anything that was written or drawn or painted, or a relic of the past of any kind, that we can talk about what those sources mean, or secondary sources, which are analyses by historians, where we read competing analyses often, or we'll read one analysis by a historian and pick it apart, not necessarily just to destroy it, but to find why does it work and how does it work, what is it based on, and what are its methods, and so on. So that's teaching. That's a visible part. It's usually pretty easy to explain. The other part, the research, I'm leaving out, by the way, university service and professional service, which is a whole other thing, quite boring and not actually doing history. The other kind of doing history is research. Most historical research is done in a place called an archive. Some people don't know what an archive is, and I've noticed from teaching students recently, they really taught me that they think of digital archives. I'm thinking of a building when I think of an archive. I'm thinking of literal reading rooms where I have sat and worked many, many hours of my life, and will many more. When I say historians generally work in archives, people today, particularly people younger than me, actually are understanding digital archives, meaning sets of data, organized data online. That can also be where we work. But those are two different things. So I want to clarify a little bit, make sure we're all on the same page on what an archive is. For me, an archive is a building. An archive is analogous to a library. We all know what a library is. We've all been to a library. A library houses published written work, sometimes other kinds of stuff, but largely written work. And anybody can go in. In certain private libraries, you need certain credentials, but you go in and you read stuff, and the stuff is housed in the library, right? An archive is the same thing, but for unpublished materials, which means that each individual archive does not have the same copies of the same stuff in some other library. Like in a library, we can go to a different branch library and read the same things that are in a nearby branch library, right? Or university libraries that have much more extensive collections of much rarer books. There's still going to be often multiple copies in multiple university libraries, right? Some of the rarest things, there might be one copy left of a published book, and it might be in special collections that don't circulate in a library. But it's all published stuff, although some special collections are actually more like archives. But anyway, an archive as a standalone thing is like a library, but it houses all unpublished things, meaning there is only one copy, the original, of each of the things that it houses. All of the materials inside are the original, literally handwritten for things old enough, or typed or whatever, but the original copy of something that may have been later published, like the original manuscript of a book that was later published, for example. The original manuscript may be slightly different, or it simply shows handwriting, which can be indicative of whatever, or it's just a relic of a very famous book as it was originally written, whatever. But also mostly what archives contain are things that have never been published. People's private letters and diaries, government documents, but all kinds of other things too. Lots and lots and lots of legal records, like transactions from trials, but also the really boring like land transactions and birth and death dates, all those registers of marriages, birth, deaths, marriages, all that kind of stuff. Those are the things in archives. Sometimes parts of those collections or whole collections will be digitized. God bless all of the people who work on this, because it is the most wonderful thing in the world for historians not to have to go through the expense and time of travel to a specific archive that is the only place on earth where you can see a particular document. That is what I've spent most of my research life doing so far. I still will have to, undoubtedly, because we cannot digitize everything in the world, not in my lifetime anyway. And my particular area of study is in Russia, where Russian archives are far slower to digitize or to give permission for anybody to see that digitized stuff. So for me, archives are still really crucial. Physical archives, which particular place you have to go to. But digital archives are increasingly available for a lot of things. And that is something that anyone can explore online. Some of them you need university credentials of some kind to access the database. And others you would literally have to go to a building. And you're not going to be able to go into an archive like you can a public library. You have to have credentials. Generally speaking, it's some kind of letter or form you fill out that explains your academic background and your reason for your research. Lots of ordinary people will go to an archive to do family history, for example, and it's not that hard, generally speaking, wherever you are in the world. It's actually often easier for a Russian citizen, for example, to get into a Russian archive to research their own family than it is for me as a foreign researcher to go in and study the documents that are necessary to the work that I do. It varies, but we go to archives. Once in an archive, we have to identify what documents are actually relevant to our questions. We have some kind of research question, something we want to know about cause and effect in the past. That is generally we did develop our research question by reading a lot of what everybody else has read so far. We read lots and lots of archive guides and other kinds of finding aids, which are materials that help you know what documents exist out there. For Russia, this is very difficult. For other places, there's abundant guides and explanations to what's available. But you start to make some educated guesses about what questions have not yet been answered, that you find interesting, that are relevant to all kinds of bigger and broader questions of general interest, and where there might be documents that can help you answer those. That's a long process. That usually takes most people at least a year of full-time dedicated work to get to that point of really developing a question. Then you can go to archives, because you have to identify which archives. Once you get in the archives, you have to identify documents. For me, for example, going to Russian archives, I often can only get a pretty vague idea of what's actually there before I set foot in the place. I don't really get more details until I'm in the place. And for a lot of documents that were, last cataloged in the 1920s when they literally entered the archive, and not since, you can't really know what's in there until you actually order it and get your hands on it, which is also a very slow process, by the way. You only can get a few things at a time. You have to stay in a special reading room. There's often it varies from archive to archive, but there can be very strict rules about what you can use in Russian archives until recently. And I think still in a lot of the archives in Russia, it's impossible to use a laptop even to take notes. You have to take written notes by hand. And to get photocopies or microform copies of anything is extremely expensive and extremely limited in what you can get permission to copy. Other archives, particularly in the United States, for example, you can just walk in, order copies, digital PDFs of whole collections, pay a nominal amount and walk away, which is why American historians, for example, Americanist historians who study the United States can work much faster and more cheaply than many of us who work in other parts of the world where it's more complicated and slower and more costly. In any case, so there's a stage of work known as the archival stage where you're gathering materials, and that process itself is incredibly labor intensive and incredibly creative because you have to think really creatively about what might have been saved in the archive and how to find it. And then you're reading lots and lots of things, most of which, frankly, are very boring. And you're thinking really creatively about how you can use different documents to show different things. It's hard work. It's incredibly thoughtful work. It requires training. We don't actually get as much training as we should in graduate programs. Most of them tend not to put a lot of training into that. It's something I would like to see change. In any case, that's the archival stage. So you've developed a question that could take at least a year. Archival stage, usually at least a year. Russian archives, you really properly need 2 years to get a book length project worth of stuff minimum, but you usually can't get funding for more than one if you're lucky. And that would be for the best funded first book. It's even harder later on for a lot of reasons, subject to another video. But once you've got your materials, then what? Then you can start writing. That process could take anywhere from 6 months to 10 years, easily, depending on what you're trying to write about, depending on its complexity and how much it's best explained with intersections of other people's work that you have to also get into and connect and put it all together. Also, of course, if your archival materials are not in English and you're publishing in English, which is my case, it's true for a lot of people, you are translating these documents as well. And there's lots of kind of decisions to be made about how you're going to go about that and what exactly you're going to do and everything when you do it, all of those things. But writing is not just sitting intensely in front of a keyboard rapidly typing, right? Like they'll show in the movies. It is a lot of that, many, many hours of that. But it's also hugely about revising and sharing your work with other people. You write. That is a incredibly painful process for everybody who writes for a living. I think more so even than people who don't write very much. It's incredibly painful. It takes a lot of revision, but then you need to show your writing to real readers and get comments from real readers. And we especially need to get comments from our colleagues, other people who do research, other people who deal with these kinds of documents, other people who deal with these same kinds of questions, because they're going to see things we didn't. And that's a hugely important part of how our methods are maintained in a rigorous way, that we put them to the test against other people who work in the same ways and have the same training and who know the materials as well as we do, or as close to as well as we do as possible. And then you incorporate all of that feedback in endless rounds of revisions, right? And then eventually you publish. Academic historians tend to publish in one of two forms, either an article or a book chapter in an edited volume, which are both about the same length, about 30 to 50 pages, generally speaking, or a whole book. Known as a monograph, a single authored study that takes place over the scope of a book, meaning 150 to 500 pages, usually around 250 to 300 max. These days, it's really hard to get anything over 300 pages published. And they really want it to be less than that because of the cost of publishing and the small audiences for academic history books. So then we try to publish. That's a whole other process as well of going through peer review. So now this is a formalized way where your publisher reaches out to people who, they choose, not you, not as the author. The publisher chooses reviewers who are meant to be similar experts in the same or closely related field. They read through it again to, again, look for mistakes, but also to check the methodology, to look for holes in the reasoning. Peer review is not supposed to be about whether the reviewer agrees or not with your conclusions. It often ends up being that, which is really to the detriment of the system. It's meant to be poking holes in the fundamental methods, the rigor of the project. Are the questions well explained? Is the reasoning logical throughout? Is the evidence real evidence, obviously, but used ethically and much more importantly, what's usually at issue, are you sort of mining it for as much as you can get? Is there other evidence that's out there that you didn't use that maybe could have been used, that could have answered the question more directly? those kinds of things. And then your editor, wherever you're publishing for the journal or for a book press, will also have questions, and those questions are going to be much more about readability. What audiences this is intended for? Are you reaching that audience effectively? Organization of the whole for clarity and so on. Because you're going to revise for all of those things, and then eventually it gets around to publishing. So the publishing process itself can take 2 to 5 years quite easily. Generally 1 to 2 years, ideally, but delays are rampant. So what is an academic historian doing from day to day? Well, our schedule usually varies a lot. In a semester, we are on a teaching schedule, which means we have an absolutely unbendable, inflexible teaching schedule, usually, Tuesdays and Thursdays, or Mondays, Wednesdays, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, whatever, some kind of, you've probably seen a college teaching schedule. Most historians, if you're full-time at a research-based university, would be teaching what we call a 2-2 load, meaning 2 courses at a time each semester, fall and spring. That's the kind of traditional pattern. If it's a university on a quarter system, it would be 3 quarters rather than 2 semesters, for example, and that would be a 2-2-2 generally. Sometimes, particularly very research-oriented universities, you might have a 2-1, 2 courses one semester, one another. If you're on quarters, it might be a 2-1-1 or a 2-2-1, something like that. In less research-oriented, more teaching-oriented institutions, you would teach more. I, for example, have a 3-3 teaching load, meaning I teach 3 courses in the fall, 3 courses in the spring every year, unless I have some kind of, I have some kind of release to do something else for that time. If I'm teaching in a community college, it might be more like a 4-4 or 4-5, or even 4-6, 5-6. Some of those exist. That's the number of courses per semester. And if I'm adjuncting, I'm going to have a whole other video on different kinds of professors and their ranks and workloads and so on. But adjuncting is paid only by the credit hour, meaning you're not paid to prepare, you're not paid to grade. You're paid only for the hours you're standing in front of students. You're not paid to do research. And that is a very small amount of money. It's really, really underpaying for the level of expertise, even for those short hours that actually count towards the pay, let alone the actual hours you have to put in to do this effectively, remotely effectively. So if you're adjuncting, some people have put together even more, 5-6 courses is not unusual for an adjunct. So that's a lot of teaching. When you're not teaching, whether that's on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because your teaching schedule is a Tuesday, Thursday, or whether that's on spring break, summer break, etc., that's when we do the research. When else would we do it? Because we're busy teaching when we're teaching, right? And teaching is far more than the credit hours, the hours you're standing in front of students. You're doing all this other work, right, that adjuncts aren't paid for. Some of us who are lucky are paid for that, but it takes a huge amount of time to prepare new courses. I teach new courses very regularly. I teach a variety of courses. I have to remind myself of each one, and I tinker with it every single time. And then, of course, there's all the grading, the reading, student work, and so on. Responding to student emails is probably the biggest time suck of them all, let alone tracking down student papers that were turned in the wrong place, the wrong format, or with an ambiguous file name. It takes up tons of time. So teaching, for me, has always been equivalent to 40-hour week full-time job. And what I mean by that is it is way more than 40 hours a week in the weeks of the semester that I'm teaching. Some weeks better than others. Some, like grading period week, really bad, really intense, working practically around the clock to get grades in on time. Other weeks a little bit less, but anytime when work is due, it's going to be more, etc. Averages out, I would say, to 40 hours a week during teaching time, but it's only 40% of my job description. 20% is actually service to the university or the profession. Another 40% is research. When is that research done? Well, they don't pay us. I mean, we're paid on a 9-month contract. It's often, in my case, it's paid out over the 12 months, but it is a 9-month contract. You're paid for 9 months. Well, most of that 9 months you're teaching, very, very full-time, if not more than full-time. When do you do the research? You do it on your own time and your own money, because summer break is not a break. That's the only time I have to do research. I have to hunt down outside sources of funding to pay for me to go to Russia to work in an archive in Russia, which is the only way I can do my kind of research. Even though that is required of my job, I have to pay myself, and I have done it out of pocket many times, or find someone else who will pay through some kind of fellowship competition or something to enable me to actually do the research that my job depends on. And that is extremely typical. So that's what most of us are doing. Very well-funded top research schools, and we're talking here about Ivies and Ivy Plus, the Ivy Leagues plus Stanford, Chicago, at Berkeley, et cetera. They pay for you to do research. And that's part of why you'll see those kinds of names of the Ivy Plus schools behind a lot of the professors you see on TV, the professors you've heard of, the professors whose books you might have read. They are paid and given time to do that research and given enormous support, connections, lots and lots of opportunities to share their work with others. It can be much more slower and painful and expensive process for those of us who are not at research-based universities. Yet we're still required to do it. It's still part of our work. So yes, that's how we work. A lot of it, frankly, is boring to look at. A lot of it is thinking, reading, and writing. But it's also much more creative than you probably think. It's also a lot more expensive than you probably think, and it's a lot more self-funded than you might ever guess.